why did Jesus have to die? That is, you might say, the most central question in the whole Christian faith. Why did he have to die? And if you ask that question of many Christians, you might get a few answers. You might have people who say things like, well, Jesus died for my sins. Jesus died to save me. Or maybe someone might say Jesus died so that I could go to heaven. And those are good answers. They're all right, but every so often, you'll come across a really annoying person like me who tries to get in underneath those questions and answers and kind of bug you about them. And so this annoying person comes along and says, okay, that's fine, but didn't you say that this God of yours was all-powerful? That your God could do anything he wanted, and did you not also say that God was merciful and filled with loving kindness? Well, if God is merciful and loving, if God can do whatever he wants, can't he just forgive you? I mean, sure, yes, God has, you have sinned, you've done things wrong, but if God is all-powerful and as merciful as you say, why would he let that stand in the way of him forgiving you? Where then is the necessity for Jesus to die this painful, bloody death? And so if you ask questions like that after a while, you will eventually get someone who will come up with you with the official answer, the full answer to that question. And the standard answer to that question today goes like this. Yes, God is merciful. Yes, God is loving and forgiving. God would like nothing more than to forgive you. But, there's a but. But God is just. In fact, God is so just and so essential to his nature that God cannot just let sin or wrongdoing slide. He can't just forgive it without there being some satisfaction, without there being some punishment or payment for that wrong. It's part of God's nature to be that just. And so, that's where Jesus comes in. God looked around to find someone who could step in and satisfy that justice, pay the penalty, and take the punishment, so that he could forgive us. And it turned out there was only one person who would fit the bill, because it had to be someone who had no punishment to pay on their own behalf, who had done nothing wrong. And so God looked around and he tapped his only begotten Son on the shoulder. And he said, you've got to do it. And so God sent Jesus down to live among us, to live an entirely perfect and innocent life, and to die as an innocent man. And in doing that, taking that punishment, making that payment, he was able to satisfy God's justice. And that's why God can forgive us. So that is basically the standard explanation these days in the church for why Jesus had to die. It's a good explanation. It makes good logical sense. It's a compelling story. The name for this explanation, by the way, in case you want to know, is the Substitutionary Theory of Atonement. It's called that because the central idea is this idea of substitution, of Jesus taking our place, taking the punishment that we deserved for us. And in fact, the Substitutionary Theory of Atonement is so compelling that many Christians have concluded that this is the only way you can possibly understand the meaning of the death of Jesus. And that this is how Christians have always understood it. But that, I'm afraid, is simply not true. In fact, this explanation, the Substitutionary Theory of Atonement, has only been around for about 1,000 years. So half of the length of time of the life of the Christian church, this theory has been in existence. Which leads to my next question. What happened 1,000 years ago that led to the creation of this particular theory? Let's go back 1,000 years, approximately. The year is 1066. Now, any English school girl or schoolboy can tell you what happened in the year 1066. It's the most significant date in the history of the country of England. For in that year, the country of England was invaded and conquered by the Normans. The Normans came in and they took over the entire government, local administration, all throughout England. Now, who were the Normans? They came from France. They spoke a peculiar dialect of French, but the Normans weren't actually French. They were, in fact, Norsemen. They were Viking raiders. Now, they had settled in France for a little while, but they were still Viking raiders. And they conquered England as Viking raiders. And they set up an administration and a government and an entire justice system based on a Viking philosophy of government. Basically what that meant, in every local area, the local Viking lord was judge and jury. In any case, he settled. He made any judgments, he settled any disputes, he punished any offenders. Now imagine yourself in England, after 1066, accused of a crime. It would not be very easy to be brought before a Viking lord for judgment, would it? Because, you know, the Vikings were famous for many things. But mercy was not one of them. And in fact, Vikings had this very prickly sense of justice. And in fact, no Viking lord would ever forgive any wrong without there being some sort of satisfaction. Payment had to be made. Punishment had to be suffered in order for there to be forgiveness and mercy. The judicial motto of the Vikings was, justice must be satisfied. That was how the government worked in England after 1066. Now you're probably wondering why I'm all of a sudden talking about the Norman conquest of England. What on earth does that have to do with the substitutionary theory of atonement? As it turns out, it has everything to do with it. Because about 30 years after the conquest, the second Norman king of England appointed a man named Anselm to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Anselm was a very smart guy. And a few years later, he wrote a book. He wrote a book to defend the Christian faith against those who would attack it, particularly the Jews and the Muslims. And the title of his book was Cur Deus Homo, in Latin. In English, that is, why did God become a human being? So basically, what Anselm was doing was he was trying to answer that key question. Why did Jesus have to come and live among us? And why did he have to die? And Anselm's book is very significant because in that book, Anselm offered for the very first time in the history of the church the answer that I have been talking about. Anselm's answer was that Jesus had to come and die in order to satisfy God's inflexible justice by taking our punishment so that God could forgive us. Anselm invented the substitutionary theory of atonement. Isn't that interesting? For 1,000 years, church had gone along just fine without that theory. All of a sudden, after the Norman Conquest, that theory was proposed. And I would suggest to you that Anselm was in fact about the only person who could have come up with that theory. Why? Because that theory requires a certain peculiar understanding of God. You cannot have this theory unless you have this idea that God is just, and so just that he simply cannot forgive anything without satisfaction, without there being some punishment or payment. Now, for 1,000 years, it had never occurred to any Christians that God might be like that. For 1,000 years. Until Anselm came along. Anselm, as Archbishop of Canterbury, spent a lot of time in Norman courts, watching Viking lords in action, watching them make their judgments. Where do you suppose Anselm got the idea that God's justice was so inflexible that he could not forgive, he could not give mercy without satisfaction, without payment? I think it's pretty obvious where he got that idea from. So basically, when we have the substitutionary theory of atonement, we are kind of stuck with an image of God based on a Viking lord and his prickly sense of justice. That's why I think in some ways the Vikings messed us up in our Christian theology. Now I realize that any image of God that we ever take, any way we ever have of talking about God, is based on some human model. I mean, when we want to talk about the God, the best we can do is say, well, God is sort of like this, or kind of like that. The Bible is full of images that are used to talk about God. The Bible talks about God as a father, a Near Eastern king, a kind master, a loving mother. Yes, that is an image used of God in the Bible. The Bible never talks about God as a Viking lord. And all those other images, the father, the mother, the Eastern king, all of those people were much more likely to act in mercy than your average Viking lord. But with Anselm's theory, we're kind of stuck with this image of God as a Viking lord. That's why I think it's probably time for the church to get by its obsession with the substitutionary theory of atonement. To think that's the only way to think about or talk about the meaning of the death of Jesus. There are other ways. I suspect better ways to think about it. The Bible doesn't speak of the death of Jesus as somehow satisfying a Norman sense of justice. Most often, more often than not, it speaks of the death of Jesus as a sacrifice. And you need to understand that an animal sacrifice in the ancient world was not a substitution. They did not see it as a substitution. When a family took its sheep up to the altar, there was no sense in which they thought that that sheep was taking the place of one of the family members. There was no sense in which they saw the death of that sheep as a punishment. They made it as painless as possible. The sheep was not taking punishment for the sake of a family member either. It was not a substitution. That's why I wanted to take some time during this season of Lent to understand how sacrifice functioned in the ancient world. I've tried to make the point that, well, first of all, it served a very practical purpose. Basically, animal sacrifice was the food safety system of the ancient world. It gave them a means of occasionally eating meat and minimizing the risks. So the sacrificial system did that by providing a professional class of people who were trained in humanely slaughtering and correctly butchering animals. These people were called priests. More important than that, the sacrificial system offered a way for them to get rid of the leftovers, those parts of the animals that they did not or could not eat, by burning them up on the altar. So animal sacrifice fulfilled a practical need. But that wasn't all it was about. Animal sacrifice also fulfilled a spiritual need. It served the purpose of bringing the people together and bringing them together with their God. For they saw the sacrifice as a shared meal. The family took their portion of the meat, they sat down by the altar, cooked it up, and ate it there. The rest of the animal, except for a portion that the priest got to keep, the parts they wouldn't eat, the fat, the bones, that was burnt up on the altar. And they saw it as a shared meal. They were eating here, their God was eating there. It was a way of bringing God and human beings together. And so for ancient people, sacrifice was the primary way that they related to God. And that is how I think of the death of Jesus, as a sacrifice. Yes, Jesus did die for us. That's what that means. Yes, Jesus died to take care of the problem of sin. But you need to understand that problem of sin is a problem of separation. We had wandered far from God. We were alienated from God. And Jesus brought us back into relationship with God through his death, a sacrifice. It's not all that helpful to think of the death of Jesus primarily as a substitution, because Jesus didn't speak of it that way. Jesus didn't speak of his death as a substitution. He spoke of it in terms of participation. That's what he said. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. He's not saying there that his crucifixion is for you. He's saying he's not doing it for you, you're doing it for him. You're doing it with him. And in participating in that, that's where the transformation begins. And to try and answer Anselm's difficult question, this is how I would answer that question. Why did God become human? Cur Deus homo. God became human. Jesus came among us to show us what the grace and the love of God looked like. For he knew it wasn't going to be enough. Simply to explain it in words, we had to be shown. Jesus came among us to show God's love and grace. But the world couldn't stand that. The world cannot stand such perfect love, cannot stand to be shown how wrong it is, so the world's response to Jesus was predictable. He was bound to end up on a cross sooner or later. That's how the world responds. And then Jesus did something amazing. Jesus took his death, terrible, tragic, painful as it was, and transformed it into something else. Transformed it into a sacrifice. In the old sense. A means of bringing us back into relationship with God. A sacrifice effective for all times. For anyone who will participate in it. By taking up their cross and following him. Will you take a few moments in quiet?